Welcome to our January 360 presentation. I'm Curator of Education Anna Smith, and today I'm pleased to introduce artist Mark Dion. Mark Dion has compared the mission of his work to the mission of a museum. Both offer a means to gain knowledge through things. These things that Dion presents to viewers often hold up a mirror to the present condition of humanity's relationship with the natural world. Dion's long-standing interest in exploring how ideas about natural history are visualized and how they circulate in society has led him to create work that questions, sometimes playfully, sometimes hauntingly, the objectivity of science. Dion's work has been presented at many U.S. and international museums and galleries, including major exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art, New York, Tate Gallery, London, and the Sterling and Francine Clark Institute in Massachusetts. Dion works worldwide and has recently undertaken large-scale projects in Essen, Germany, in London, in Norway, and in Seattle. I know we're all looking forward to hearing from the artist himself, so please join me now in welcoming Mark Dion.
Hello, thank you so much for coming today. I'm Mark Dion, and just in case you don't recognize me, I wore the same shirt as the brochure, so you would know. And today I'm going to do something that might be, well, for some of you it will be nostalgic. For some of you it will probably be an entirely novel experience. I'm going to do a slide presentation. And slides are, there's usually a mount of plastic or cardboard, and there's a transparency. Light shines through, creating an image of remarkable clarity and perfect color correction. So, and like many old school slide shows, which were about people's travels to distant parts of the world, Uncle Harold's trip to Fiji and things like that, my slideshow is very much a travelogue, because for better or worse, I'm a very international traveling artist. I'm very internationalized. So without further ado, I'm going to start. I'm trying to figure out, this is my button here. Okay, and we're going to start on, normally I try to show a chronological presentation and start with some early work, but I want to show you something that I'm very excited about because it just opened in the end of September, early October, in Norway. And Norway is an absolutely fascinating place. Norway, of course, as you all know, is incredibly wealthy because of its petroleum wealth and its exploitation of that. And because of that enormous amount of money, they have been investing in infrastructure. And so they've been building new opera houses and universities and airports and road systems and all sorts of other things with that money, and investing in the future of the country. So one thing they did was the roads there are incredibly perilous. The main road from Bergen to Oslo was impassable during the winter most of the time. And so what they've done is make these tunnels. The tunnels are enormous. There's one tunnel that is 26 kilometers long. It's the longest tunnel in the world. And so after this project was done, what do we do with the old roads? And the old roads go over mountain passes. They go past glacial ponds. It's some of the most extraordinary landscape you can imagine. And they said, well, we'll turn this into the tourist road. And the tourist road, people can come and enjoy the country. And so busloads of Italians and Japanese and Korean people look at this incredible landscape. And they said, well, to sweeten the deal, we're going to spend 10 years inviting young architectural firms to build new pavilions, to build anything you need, a roadside stop, a scenic overlook, a little rest area. We're going to have these very young architects do radical projects. And they did that, and it was very successful. For 10 years, they won lots of architectural awards. And they said, okay, now it's time, let's do the same thing with artists. So they commissioned Louise Bourgeois. There's a Turrell project they're working on. The last project of both Louise Bourgeois and Fischli and Weiss, and they invited me to do a project. And so I came and saw this beautiful landscape, and this is the site I picked, which is the pass over the Arlen Mountain. And I thought, well, the worst thing in the world I could do is destroy this landscape with a sculpture. I mean, that would just be insane. It's an incredibly beautiful landscape. Oh, there it is. Okay. It has this wonderful ecology of tundra, filled with remarkable, it's really like almost a forest in miniature, right? Beautiful, rare plants. So I wanted to make something that, of course, enhanced your experience of this landscape without destroying it. So, and also played with the history of this site. I brought my team. We worked for 3 years on this project. We took over one of the abandoned grocery stores in the middle of the town. We became very familiar with people over there. We worked 1 month each year. And we created a passage to the underworld. We built a raised cement walkway that you could traverse without crunching this beautiful, very fragile tundra ecology. And then you enter this space. You walk about 25 feet down a dark corridor. It's only about this high, which is my revenge on all those tall Norwegian people. So they're bumping their heads constantly. And then you find yourself in a room. And you're in this room, and you are in front of a very large diorama. And that diorama depicts an interior of a fantastical cave. And it's all glitter and blue light. It's lit by a skylight because we are so far from electricity. So the entire piece is lit by this skylight. And this diorama depicts a large brown bear, and she's sleeping on the ruins of civilization, or she's sleeping on material culture. So that's starting at the bottom with Paleolithic and Neolithic objects, and working up to through Viking culture, Roman culture, the beginnings of stable agriculture and civilization, right up to iPod chargers, and you see a slide carousel, things that are just barely archaic. Here you see some of the things from the earlier parts, the Neolithic objects, stone tools, whatever we couldn't find or buy, we just made. And I work with such amazingly talented sculptors, usually people who are trained in theater. So I just tell them, make me a Viking helmet. I need it in 2 days, and they make me a Viking helmet. They're kind of incredible. I have an incredible team of people who are all artists, and I have no studio or permanent employees. We just kind of assemble when we have a project, and then we disband, and they have their own things in their lives. Okay, so I just want to show that, just to show you what I've been up to and what I'm really excited about. And that was, for me, a really exciting commission. I'm going to time travel back now to 1992, where this incredibly handsome, young, thin man was invited to do a project in Venezuela. And I was invited by 2 museums to do a project. I asked each of the museums to create 4 empty tables. And each of those tables represented a week that I was traveling in the Amazonas territories of Venezuela, traveling in a dugout canoe with the Paro people. And there I was collecting a variety of natural objects. At the end of each week, my objects would go, whoops, I didn't mean to do that, would go from my canoe, there we go, thanks, would go into a box. That box would go onto the canoe. We'd rendezvous with a speedboat. The speedboat would take the box to the port. It would go onto a truck, onto a plane, cross country, onto another truck, into the museum, and then the museum technicians would open it, and I told the curators that there would be instructions as to how the things should be shown, should be exhibited, but that wasn't true. So they open this box, and they have no idea what they're looking at. They have no idea what to do with what they're looking at. Any kind of narrative I might have had, any kind of presentation of relationships, of ecological relationships, of place, was completely lost, impossible for them to interpret. So by the time the second boxes arrive, they're no longer in a panic. They no longer just blurt the stuff out. They say, okay, it's true, there's no instructions, there probably never will be, but we're professionals. We're museum professionals. We know how to deal with things. We can deal with it formally. We know that long things go with long things, round things go with round things. And they come up with a perfectly sensible, formal solution to how to show this material. And they do that for the rest of the boxes as well. This is the kinds of things that are arriving for them. And so, there is of course, this wow moment when things come. There's a wow moment when people encounter these things. And of course, what I think about as you could call it the temporal context for this, of course, is in 1992. People are thinking a lot about 1492. People are thinking a lot about how Europe's mind was blown by the discovery of the Americas and by an entire world of new plants, animals, and materials and cultures that had never been encountered, never been anticipated before. Now, the last box I sent is not so much what I've taken from the jungle, but rather what I brought with me. So trying to shift the focus, make it very clear that the real specimen here is myself in this kind of guise of the colonial naturalist, almost like a kind of reenactor. So someone, in a way, what I didn't want to do is be the kind of artist who wags their finger at the explorers of the past and the mistakes they made and the inappropriateness of their endeavor, but rather implicate myself a little more into that, as my psyche is certainly constructed by that fantasy and that image as well. I'm not entirely innocent. These are the last boxes. So, as an artist, I've always been very influenced and interested by fields outside of the art world as well. And I've strived really to work with science museums, natural history museums, zoos, botanical gardens, other kinds of institutions that share my passion for the history of natural history and the representation of the natural world. I mean, that's really my problem in my work. My question in the work is, how is it that certain things get to be called nature at any particular time by a particular group of people? So one of the first projects I did like this was done in a small museum in Switzerland. And I was invited to do a project, but I was actually traveling in the Amazon at the same time. So I asked them to create a vitrine, an empty display case. And while I was traveling, I would identify vertebrates, so fish, reptiles, amphibians, and birds. And whatever I could positively identify, I would make a list, and mammals. That list would get downriver, get to a hotel with a fax machine. It would be faxed to the museum. And if they had the animal, they would, or any of the animals on the list, they would add it to the vitrine. So I never knew if this was going to be bursting with things or it was going to be completely empty. So I was very interested in that idea of chance, of contingency, but not the kind of same chance like you see in people like John Cage, perhaps, but something else, a chance that really teases out aspects of the ideology of the museum itself. Museums at this time, 19th century natural history museums, they're striving to be like Noah's Ark. They want at least two good examples of everything, right? But that desire is really frustrated by the practicality of the place. So Switzerland doesn't have the colonial clout maybe that Germany or Britain had. So their collections aren't as global. Maybe, when the boat shows up on a particular island, it's raining. So they don't have as great representations from that island. Maybe the collector of insects is more interested in crickets than beetles. And so she lets the beetle collection languish a little bit, and the cricket collection just grows and grows and grows. This is what I think about as the subjective nature of the museum. These are the subjective reasons why the museum doesn't achieve its perfect microcosm, which is the kind of desire of the museum in general. So, for instance, in this case, there's a long list of animals, but they only have the great kiskadee. Everybody has a great kiskadee. Kiskadees even come here to Texas. So some years later, those boxes that were in Venezuela arrive in New York City and become part of an exhibition I do with American Fine Arts, in which I create 3 fictional bureaucracies, and the job of those bureaucracies is to organize the natural world. Each of those bureaucracies has a different sensibility, a different kind of methodology, a different way of doing things. So this is the New York State Bureau of Tropical Conservation. So in this case, I'm not thinking about conservation like wildlife protection. I'm thinking about it more as like art conservation. And I worked for years as an art conservator. So every leaf, every twig, every severed butterfly wing comes out of those boxes and is carefully preserved by this handsome young man and cataloged, wrapped in acid-free paper and glassine, given a retrieval number and put onto this shelf. So that process of protecting each thing also means that each thing is no longer accessible. So it's not big game hunting. There's no trophy on the wall. There's only a box with a number and something that has been put into a condition where it will never rot, but it will also never be seen. And then once that's done, my job as the sculptor has been to constitute a collection. And so that bureau is closed. All of the apparatus, all of the material it took to do the task of cataloging and preserving and cleaning disappears. And what you have is the collection. And then each of these pieces also had a kind of door, because that gives you a sense of the sensibility of the task. And I think that each one of these, I think about them a little bit like period pieces in a sense. The door kind of gives a clue. As I said, each of these bureaucracies was generated through an expedition, and not all those expeditions were to exotic, faraway places like Venezuela. This was an expedition 5 blocks over to New York City's Chinatown, where for 4 hours I collected every fresh sea creature I could get my hands on. These were brought to the museum and put on ice. And the methodology or the strategy behind this particular collection was orthodox taxonomy. So to take each of those organisms and find out what it is. What is its proper name in science? You can imagine there's a little bit of urgency behind this task. Once I could tell what something was, it was given its common name and proper scientific binomial name and placed on a shelf in the kind of order that you would find it in a scientific collection. Now, this is something this is hard even for people who know what they're doing to do. Identification of organisms is not an easy thing. You go through this process of keying out, which is a process of eliminating possibilities by looking at physical traits. And so that's really hard. And one of the reasons it's also extra hard is because in Chinatown, you don't know where these animals are coming from. So if you have an octopus, you don't know if that's come from the Mediterranean, the Sea of Cortez, the South China Sea. So it's really difficult. And also, I'm not a biologist, and I'm certainly not an ichthyologist. So I'm punching above my weight. So this isn't the artist taking on the mantle of scientific truth. This is someone really struggling with something and really struggling with a discipline that is a bit above their field of expertise. And so I'm always suspicious of the way artists use science. The science really is the voice of authority in our society. So I'm always trying to find a way, when I engage with science, to undercut the mastery of that. I could just claim to be an ichthyologist, and who's going to know? But an ichthyologist would know. And so I want to make it clear that when I'm working with these things, that I am a engaged, interested amateur, but that's it. And a big part of my work is a kind of celebration of the dilettante tradition, meaning that the tradition started with people like Goethe and Schiller, when to be a dilettante meant someone who's interested in everything, as opposed to being a dabbler, which I don't think I'm a dabbler. So again, once I've finished, all of the stuff goes away, all the material goes away, and what we're left with is the collection. And this is the Department of Marine Animal Identification of the City of New York, the Chinatown Division. So, and every good bureaucracy needs a really good bureaucratic name. I'm very happy to say I've seen this piece recently, and those fish are still in good shape. This was done in, I think, 1993 maybe, and that preservation technique really works incredibly well, and this is just alcohol. And I also did a project called the Department of Marine Animal Identification of the city of San Francisco, the Chinatown division, and I love the idea of doing the same project in different places and really kind of testing this notion of what context does when you change it and what can happen to a project in a different location. A lot of my work is also inspired by people who I think are linchpin figures in the history of natural history. So people who really, what nature means is really different before and after them. So people like, of course, people like Aristotle and Baron Georges Cuvier and Darwin and people like that, and people like Rachel Carson. And some of those people are we know very well, and some of those people have kind of disappeared. And this is one of them. This is Charles Beebe, or Charles William Beebe, otherwise known as William Beebe. He was a great popular writer. He wrote 26 what we'd call best-selling books. He was the curator of birds for the Bronx Zoo. And he also, he wrote for the New Yorker. He did radio broadcasts. He was quite a celebrity in his time. And this is at the turn of the last century. This is actually a photo from 1917. And in 1917, after the war, he was kind of disgusted by the First World War, which he flew in. And he decided that if you're studying biology, the science of life, maybe spending all your time in the basement of the Natural History Museum working on dead things is not the best place to do it. So he believed that you could take the laboratory out of the basement and into the field. And of course, now people do this all the time. That's really the standard way people do things. But in 1917, there's not a lot of people doing this. So he created the first biological field stations in tropical America. This was in Guyana, where he brought teams of people, botanists and ornithologists, ichthyologists, invertebrate scientists, artists, photographers, to come and work at the station and look into ecology, look into the relationships between things rather than just the things themselves. So, really interesting guy. And he wrote beautiful books. So this one is what was called Jungle Peace that he produced in 1917 from this. One of the stories is that he's just about to leave, and he's taking his steamer from Belém at the mouth of the Amazon back to New York. Before he does, he measures out a square meter of leaf litter, and he takes that and he stuffs it into his duffel bag. Then he gets to his steamer room on the ship, and he dumps it on the table. And he spends the entire trip going back, breaking that into all of its parts. So dividing that into how many different kinds of leaves are here, how many invertebrates are in this, what kind of feathers are there, what kind of soil type. So this kind of incredibly interesting, laborious thing that would appeal to somebody like me. And of course, he discovers lots and lots of new organisms that have never been described by science. And in some way, this is a real indication that this thing that we call biodiversity is really centered in the tropics, which we all know now. And another great story of mine of his is called My Jungle Table. And My Jungle Table is a story in which he has his assistant build him a table in the forest so he can do dissections on birds, on toucans and things like that. And every time he starts, the ants smell this, and they climb up the legs of his table and eat his specimens right in front of him. And this is incredibly frustrating. So he puts the legs of the table in coffee cans of water. But that makes the table start to grow again. So the table actually sprouts and starts to grow. And then, of course, there are spiders spinning webs on tables. And inside of the wood, there are beetles, and they're knocking to each other. So it's this kind of great allegory for how impossible it is to kind of just remove one part of this big system and just look at that. And so I combine these two stories for a project at the Museum of Modern Art in Rio that happened during the Earth Summit, the first Earth Summit. So I don't know what the registrar was thinking to allow me to bring in a meter of tropical forest right into the center of the Museum of Modern Art, but they did. And so for the first 10 days or so, I was going through this material, sorting it out, finding out what was in it, breaking it into its various components, using contemporary technology, and also that was very much, sort of performative thing. And my experience was that the audience in Brazil doesn't have that kind of distance from the art object that we might have here. They get involved, sometimes really, really, really involved. So this started a whole series of entomological endeavors where I'm trying to look at some of the small things that really run the planet in a way. So I start these all over the world. This is a piece called The Great Munich Bug Hunt. We found a linden tree, which had been dead for about 5 years. We brought that into the very chic gallery district of Munich. Shikimiki, they would call it. And then working with graduate students in the entomology department from the university in Munich, we did a kind of CSI investigation on this tree. We really took it apart and looked into how many organisms this thing was supporting after its death. And, in a way, it's very much meant to go against the grain of a kind of very particular, very hygienic forestry policy that they have there, where they don't really allow something like a dead log to be in the forest. It's considered a kind of problem because it breeds other insects and it causes all sorts of problems. But we know from ecology that a tree like this is much more biologically productive when it's dead than when it's alive. And so it's an important part of forest ecology. It's not good for a tree farm, but it's really good for a forest. So each of those things was prepared in a special lab. And you can imagine that there are a lot of people coming into this gallery because it has a big glass front. And people walk by and they see a giant tree there and people in lab coats, and they kind of do a double take and come into the gallery. And we are interrogated. For me, that's kind of really an interesting point, that these projects have a kind of performative aspect, but we never pretend to be anyone else. I'm not pretending to be an entomologist. I'm an artist who is, I think, shadowing a methodology of another discipline. And we start with this cabinet, and we begin to fill this with all of the component parts, with molds and primitive plants and fungi and invertebrates and all sorts of things, even mineral specimens. And by the end, of course, this cabinet's really full. And so at a certain point, I realized that, the problem with this is that I'm always bringing nature into the museum, and maybe it's already there. So we shut down the Smart Museum of Art in Chicago over a weekend, and with my dedicated staff of amateur entomologists, we start in the basement and work our way up to the director's office, trying to find every invertebrate that's in the museum that's not supposed to be in the museum. You'd be surprised what a Tony Smith can hide if you... And so all of those things are brought together and cataloged, and then I work with a microscope technician on this platform for the first 10 days of the project, and we photograph everyone we found and catalog where they were. Perhaps not surprisingly, the registrar's office had not a single living thing. But the director's office was completely packed. And so after, as I said, there's often this kind of interactive, performative aspect where we're working on the collection, constituting the collection, and then when that's done, sometimes my platonic self stands in for me, and so while I'm off doing something else. So at this point, I found myself in a kind of tricky situation because I was very much now identified, classified as the naturalist artist. And I think anyone who studies classification knows that, once the butterfly gets a pin through it, it doesn't move very far. And so it became a problem for me that this was going to really interfere with my creative future if I just was that person who was included in every show about animals and art, green art, art and ecology. So I needed a way to kind of throw the hounds off my trail. And so I thought, well, what's really important for me about this, and what I think is my contribution to the discourse in art, is this notion of shadowing a methodology. So I just shifted what I was going to shadow away from zoology and away from ecology and toward archaeology, which is also something I had an amateur's passion for and a bit of a knowledge of. And as my mother likes to say, that's what you were doing when you were 7, digging up bottles in Massachusetts. So one of the first projects I did like this was done in 1997. I was invited as a guest of the Nordic Pavilion for the Venice Biennale because I am the Nordic ideal, and so and Venice is an amazing place with great history of art. It's a great romantic city, great history in architecture, political intrigue, and also incredibly disgusting mud. And that mud is at the bottom of these canals. So, of course, there's no car traffic in Venice. It's all by boats. And so it's very expensive for people in Venice. If you buy a washing machine, it has to come by boat. If the washing machine breaks, it doesn't necessarily have to leave by boat. In the middle of the night, it could get close to the edge and fall into the canal, and you've saved yourself some expense. And so these things do accumulate at the bottom of the canal and cause trouble for traffic. So in Venice, there is a navy of barges that dredge these canals, that go around picking up this incredibly remarkable mud. They fill the center of the barge, they take it to the lagoon, and they dump it. And they do this over and over and over again. So I thought, gee, wonder what's in that. And so we took one of those containers to the Venice Biennale. This is the Nordic Pavilion. And if you have ever smelled the bottom of these canals, you know that this didn't make us good friends with our surrounding pavilion neighbors. There are lots of complaints about that. But there is the mud, and the mud it's kind of legendary. There's all sorts of stories about it, and it is very much what people say. It's anaerobic. It's full of household waste. It has sewage, and it has chemicals and lots of petroleum, and because of where ours was, it was full of a lot of hospital material. But it is incredibly archaeologically rich. You really could not stick a pencil in this without hitting something. Venice is not an ancient city by Italian standards. There's no Roman Venice, for instance. But it's still a city that has always been very devoted to material culture. And so there's a lot of stuff there. So my project was to go through this and find out exactly what that was. And so there are 3 parts. One part was the sample itself. The second part was I turned their storage room into a small Wunderkammer, a small curiosity cabinet. But it's a little bit like the curiosity cabinet. There's curiosity cabinet that we all know that evolves into the Enlightenment Museum. Well, also had another history in the Middle Ages of course, the treasure trove. And the treasure trove is not where you show your treasures. It's where you hide your treasures. You put them in the darkest dungeon or the highest tower. The Renaissance is really when you invent bling, right? The curiosity cabinet shows your wealth, your influence, your taste, your ability to get the best of the world and bring it to you. So this is kind of a space in between that. I don't have precious metals. I have rusted bits of iron. I don't have pearls. I have bits of white ceramic and shells. I don't have emeralds. I have broken green bottles. This is kind of like my crocodile hanging from the ceiling. And whenever I do a project like this, the most important thing for me is not to really do this in a way that an archaeology museum would do it. I don't want to recapitulate their methods. It doesn't make sense if I'm telling you the same story with the same material as an archaeological museum is telling you. So I'm not going to tell about the evolution of a material. I'm not going to talk about the influence of styles from one part of the world to another part of the world. I'm trying to present something with a sense of the simultaneity of history in a way like we experience it, where you go to Venice and there's a 16th century bridge, and at the end of that bridge is an 18th century house, but it has a new McDonald's in the basement. And that's, I think, what I'm trying to get at with some of these projects. So I want to be that alien archaeologist who comes to Earth and has no idea what these things are, what they're used for, and begins a very naive kind of organization. Because it is Venice, there's a lot of ceramics and a lot of glass. And I'm putting those together. I'd like to also toy with your expectations of what it is to visit a museum and what kinds of things museums are for. So every piece here, whether it's from the Middle Ages or the Renaissance or contemporary or from the 18th century, is given a number. But you will go mad if you try to find a corresponding sheet which will tell you what those numbers are, because it doesn't exist. So I like this notion of kind of presenting the illusion of didacticism, right? It looks like it should tell you something, but when you try to find out what exactly it's telling you, good luck. And the last part, and this is representative of my earlier work too, is the laboratory. And I'm always conflating the idea of the laboratory and the studio. You know, that's really important to me. I feel, you know, my experience of visiting artists in the studio is always so rich, just like my experience of visiting scientists in the lab. I've never seen a painting that was better in the museum than it was in the studio. You know, there's something about that. So even if I can't give you that experience, I'm simulating that experience, although this was my actual studio. So in here you see things in the process of being cleaned. So you see objects still embedded in mud. You see possible different kinds of classifications going on. You know, a classification for round things, a classification for ceramics versus glass, a classification for long things. You know, that there are a number of ways I could have put this exhibition together, and so you're looking at a decision. I found everything in this project. I had no help at all. This was an entire summer, and this was the worst summer of my life. So, you know, I had my tetanus shots. It's incredibly hot there. This material is so stinky, and it doesn't just wash away. It's really greasy. So I swore I would never do another archaeological project after this one. It was such an ordeal. For my next archaeological project, I worked in the city of London. And London, of course, is a much older city than Venice is. And the reason for London being where it is because of the Thames. You know, the Thames River goes through the heart of London. It's an incredibly strong river. It's a tidal river, so it changes each day several times. And at a certain point, this area is exposed as called the foreshore. So at high tide, this would be underwater. At low tide, for about 4 hours, you can go onto the foreshore, and the foreshore is incredibly archaeologically rich. So it is just absolutely full of things. And the river is so strong when it goes in and out, it's like a new roll of the dice every time you step onto the foreshore. It's a whole new collection of stuff, because that river just scours the foreshore. So let's see. So I did a project with the Tate, and the Tate suddenly had two museums, had the Tate Modern and the Tate, what now is called the Tate Britain. And I did two archaeological digs, one in front of each of those on the Thames. Those places, Bankside and Millbank, other neighborhoods, they have very different social histories. They have really interesting social histories, but quite different, and the sites are remarkably different. And that's evidenced, of course, by what we found. So I worked with a team of volunteers, and the volunteers had to be either over 65 or under 17, so teenagers and pensioners, groups that don't often work together. And I had about 14 of each. And each day we would identify, we did 1 week of collecting on each site. We would identify an area, and they were instructed to take every bit of material culture they could find. Every human-produced object, which when you're working with that many people for that long, you can find a lot of great stuff. And I also had these were my project managers, who were fantastic, who I'd worked with for many, on various other projects. I worked with really incredible volunteers. This is Alexia and Amsini, and they were two of the most talented people I've ever met in terms of, like in archaeology, you have this notion of the search image, right? It's the thing that you keep, the image you keep in the back of your mind when you're looking for something. It helps you find that thing. Like even if you are looking for shells on the beach, right? You have this notion of shell in your head. And you walk down, and if you have a very refined search image, you find 100 shells on a walk, and your friend finds 12. And these two young ladies were amazing. They were finding needles and pins from, the London Bridge that partially collapsed into the Thames was the center of the needle, pin, wire, and nail trade. So they're pulling 18th century needles out of the sand. I mean, just incredible skill. So this is my band of pirates on any particular day. So as I said, we did 1 week at each site. The next stage of the project is we created these sort of Indiana Jones-style tents on the lawn of the Tate. Each tent contained the finds from the two sites, and then we had one kind of tent where we did lunchtime lectures and events like that. So we found easily tens of thousands of things here. So this lawn can be very crowded in the summer. It's really, think about the steps of the Metropolitan in New York or the steps of the Chicago Art Institute. It is packed in the summer. So we had this tape, and the rule was anyone except an obvious lunatic can come behind that tape. So people were able to come through. Of course, sometimes lunatics got through anyway, but people were able to come through and talk with us as we went through this process. And that process was that every single thing that we found, and to say we found tens of thousands of things is no exaggeration, came out, was cleaned and categorized and cataloged. And so this was an entire summer's long project for us. And we went through that process. It's sometimes hard to get teenagers to clean dishes all summer long, I can say. So we went through that process, really refining things. So first you clean all the glass, and then you break that down into green glass, clear glass, brown glass, purple glass, and then you break that down into bottom necks and bottom bottles and glass with writing on it. And you're just refining and refining and refining and refining. And these are just some of the bones from Bankside. Bankside was the part of London where the things that you would maybe offend the sensitive people of the city of London proper were done on Bankside. So that's where the slaughterhouses were, and the vinegar factories, and the bear baiting, and the theater, and the brothels, and the drinking went on. And all of that is evidence. And in some way, the Tate's presence there really signifies the end of a certain kind of Bankside, a Bankside that really goes back to pre-Elizabethan days. Okay, as I said, everything is cleaned and categorized and refined and refined and refined. People snoop around. They tended to treat us a little bit like the Antiques Roadshow. They wanted to know what was the oldest thing we found, what was the most valuable thing we found. I just like this man because he's such a dandy. And then finally, there is a very large double-sided cabinet created. The cabinet is based on the sort of aesthetics of the early British Museum cabinets. The British Museum, the nucleus of the first British Museum collections come out of the Thames. So ships are coming from Newcastle, barges are coming from Newcastle, unloading coal. They need to refill their ballast. They're digging up the gravel at the bottom of the Thames. And as they do that, they're finding Viking swords. They're finding Roman cups. They're finding all of this archaeology. And so these guys are being paid pennies a day, but if they pocket a Roman coin and sell that to a dealer, they're making a fortune. And so that's really the beginnings of the collector's market and the early beginnings of the British Museum collection. There's a really fascinating story about that stuff. So a double-sided cabinet, one side, of course, containing bank-side material, one side millbank material. And there's a lot of it. And this really contains about 99% of what we found. There's a few tires that we don't include, a dead dog, and a shopping cart. But otherwise, it's all in here. Okay, I think we need the next carousel. There's only 17 more carousels to go, so you're doing really well. And like the early cabinets, they're not meant to be static. They have an interactive component. You can open the drawers and look at things. And when you open the drawers, you begin to get a sense of a kind of system of classification, right? But that system, and there are many drawers that can be opened, that system is constantly changing on you. So you might open a drawer and there's ceramic objects, and they're organized by size, from smallest to largest. The next drawer is plastic bottle caps. They're organized by color. It's the color spectrum. The next drawer is locks and keys. They're organized by function. So as you're trying to figure out what's the system, and the system is constantly changing. And so what the system really is an encyclopedia of systems. This cabinet is an encyclopedia of how one might attempt to put things together, one might understand history, whether that's through chronology, through use, through color, through form. There's also, I can't show you every credit card we found. I can't show you every human tooth we found, every broken bit of mirror, every identity card, So I want to show you that there are things there that we couldn't show you. And so those are in these boxes. Here's some of the things organized by function. Here's a detail of what I call the greatest hits drawer, which has those needles and pins I talked about, and a voodoo doll, and bullets from the Second World War, and fragments of Roman ceramics, and buckles from 18th century shoes, and 18th century or Renaissance children's shoes, and silver spoons, and lice combs from the Middle Ages, and a 400 million year old sea urchin fossil, which is always good to know exactly what is the oldest thing you found. Yeah. And teeth from the bears from the bear baiting pit. So there's just like an incredible amount of stuff here. And the last element of this project is, I'm always thinking, I work with so many people on these projects, and in film, a lot of people work on the project, and at the end you have this thing called the credits. So every key grip and every lighting person and makeup people, they all kind of get acknowledged. But we don't really have something like that in the art world, so I'm always trying to imagine, if we did, what would that look like? What could that be? So this is an attempt at that. So this is photographs of all the people who worked on the project. So not just the volunteers I worked with, but also people like the curators and the publicity staff for the Tate, and all the people who kind of are behind the scenes and don't often get acknowledged. So I've done a fair number of these archaeology projects. The point of them was to not allow myself to be pigeonholed as the natural history artist, so I became pigeonholed as the archaeology artist, because these projects were in very high-profile sites like Venice and the Tate and MoMA. So and always at the center was myself orchestrating this. I had to try to think about, and I was very conscious of the way artists use their bodies to help to create a kind of alter ego, or to create a method to kind of promote your own process, in a sense. Looking very much at people like Smithson, Joseph Beuys, artists who I really admired, and the way that the art press is voracious for photos of the artist, right? We can't help ourselves. But at a certain point, that began to work against me, and this became a little bit too much about me, and I don't want this work to really be about me. So I wanted to do another archaeological project, but kind of try to step out of the center of that, or try to critique my own presence in those projects. So I did a project at the Queens Museum of Art in Flushing Meadows, and Flushing Meadows is fantastic. That's where was the site of 2 World's Fairs. Before that, Flushing Meadows was New York City's garbage dump. So if you've ever read The Great Gatsby, and I'm sure everyone in this room has, when they're driving through these mountains of ash, that's Flushing Meadows. That's the garbage dump. And so we stepped 20 feet out of the front door of the Queens Museum and started digging. And you didn't have to dig far to find an enormous amount of material. So I organized that material by chronology, not from when it was, but from when we found it. So the first thing we found to the last thing we found. And all the excess stuff we filled these sarcophagi with. And I had turned myself into a young Korean woman. And so when you came to see a Mark Dion archaeology project, you actually saw Kate Wall, my very talented assistant at the time, who had taken on the role of doing all the things that I normally do in these projects. So all of the processing, the cataloging, the drawing of the objects, all of that was taken out of my hands. And we did find, this is an extraordinary site, which we just, we've hardly scratched the surface of what's there. We found entire newspapers from 1932 that were readable. And I very much love this idea of a kind of an archaeology where things are just put next to other things without regard for material, without regard for technology, without regard for use, and a way that really feels a lot closer to everyday life. These are the sarcophagi I talked about. All right, how are we doing on time? How are you feeling? You feel like you could do a little more? You're up for it? Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about public art. Public art is the realm of art where the greatest aesthetic crimes are committed. I think you all know this. It is the worst. So I'm always looking for what would be a good model for public art, because there's so many bad models, that's not hard to find. So one of the things that really interests me is this idea of looking at, in architectural history, the category of structures that are called the folly. And the folly really exists as something in between art and architecture, and that's what I love about it. The folly are buildings that were constructed not to have a practical purpose, like a barn or a chateau, but rather I think that their purpose is to generate meaning, is to create meaning and to develop situations, right? And mad aristocrats, some of which had beautiful ruins on their properties. Others who didn't were jealous, and they built ruins on their properties. And they built grottos, and they built temples to the winds, and they built pleasure gardens, and they built magnificent hunting pavilions, and rustic houses, and just incredibly insane architecture, and great, meaningful, fascinating miniature architecture. So I became very, very interested in trying to see if we could breathe some life into that idea. And so the first project I did like this was on the border of Holland and Germany. It's at a small it's a small reserve for a kind of heath, a kind of what was once the vast historical ecology of this area, which now there's about 40 acres of left. And so it's incredibly important for science. It's not. It really is just hanging on by its fingernails. They wanted to create a kind of gateway into this area, so I suggested that we build 2 structures that are related to an empirical understanding of the natural world. The first is a traditional hunter's cabin. This, of course, is the first day it's built. And one great thing about working with the Follies is it's great to do a public work that is a ruin, because the ruin is like the only thing that gets better as it gets worse. So, you can let them graffiti this, vandals, take your best shot, You're just going to increase it. So it's constructed with great detail, with an eye to the vernacular, to how people would have built a structure like this, say, 100 years ago. And what was, for me, the biggest discovery it was a real breakthrough for me, was to realize that when I worked in this kind of architectural form, I could be a sculptor, I could work in terms of form, but I didn't have to give up the complexity, the material complexity of being an installation artist as well. So the building becomes a vitrine, and the way that viewers experience this is by looking through the windows, by having an encounter where you're peering into this. And so then I can have that material richness that I've had in museums and galleries, but it's still outside. And you could construct a kind of character, so in this case, a hunter, someone who has an intense knowledge of the natural world, who has undoubtedly great affection for it, but nevertheless, their expression of that always results in death. And it's a very paradoxical, strange situation to me. And so all of the aspects that you might find within the local culture of that are inside of this. But of course, there's always rewards for special viewers, with rewards for people who put more energy into it. And they begin to see that, there's photographs of hunters, but actually those hunters are celebrity hunters. It's Kirk Douglas, and it's Ted Nugent, and it's, it's people who might be recognized. So its companion building is also something where the scientists is a biological field station. And field stations, of course, are to help biologists deal with difficult conditions. The middle of the ocean, the Antarctic, the North Pole, the Amazon. This is 10 minutes from city center. It's not the most difficult environment in the world. But nevertheless, inside of this structure, and again, you encounter this very much like a giant vitrine. It's built as one would build a building in this area right now. And you see all of the tools and equipment for people who have an intense interest in the natural world, who want to understand the mechanisms of the natural world. And that relationship often results in death, often results in a specimen being taken. So, and again, there's also things that there are computers without electricity. There are phones without phone lines. There are clocks that never move, sinks without water. So there's enough indication that this is a discursive space. This is not a practical space. This is a space that's meant to generate meaning and reflection and not to be used. So my friends from the Gallery for Landschaftskunst in Hamburg, who are an amazingly fascinating group of artists who are organized. It's an artist collective gallery, and all the artists are organized around a contemporary interpretation of what it means to be a landscape artist today, right? So they said, well, why is it always fake with you? Why can't you do something real? Why can't you do something we can actually use? Why do you want to make buildings that can't be used or shouldn't be used? And I said, well, I don't know, let's try something. So we convinced the city of Hamburg to give us this barge, and we built this house on it. We constructed a floor on the barge, so it could be used as a kind of social space. And we made a collaboration with botanists and soil scientists from the university who were interested in the canals of Hamburg. Hamburg has more miles of canal than Venice does, as any Hamburger will tell you. And so we created this space that was used by artists, by the soil scientists had their annual conference on this space. The botanists used the barge for sampling in different places. But also, because of our association with the university, we got lots of great stuff to play with. Artists play with this stuff very differently from scientists. I can promise you that. Some might say inappropriately. But also, this in one of the things that we tried to do was fulfill this promise of the university. The university is this place where you have dedicated people working in various fields of knowledge under one roof who share ideas. No. That never happens. They never share ideas. They're never under one roof. So, but at night, over a beer or two, soil scientists and artists and plant people and the general public actually talk together in a really interesting way. And so that's the kind of thing that we wanted to happen here. And as we went on with the process, this is it in the Ulster, we had, the local scuba diving club said, could we use the barge to do a dive in the Ulster? And we said, yeah, no problem. And artists wanted to hang drawing machines off the side of the barge, and the wave action would create drawings. And we said, no problem. And somebody wanted to do nature illustration classes for young people on Saturday mornings. And we said, no problem. A woman wanted to read the Odyssey by firelight at midnight. And we said, no problem. So it became this kind of platform. People wanted to do a rave, and we said no. But otherwise, it became this kind of very open platform for interesting dynamics. And at the same time, I was interested in creating a space that was visually very generous and that kind of acknowledged a tradition or various traditions where these fields overlap and come together. And even if we trace that back and not very long ago in history. Another one of these projects was done in San Diego at Tijuana Estuary Park. Tijuana Estuary Park is located where the Tijuana River empties into the Pacific Ocean. Tijuana River is an incredibly polluted river. This is right on the border, so you have lots of border police, immigration, naturalization, trying to stop people sneaking across the border. You have lots of people sneaking across the border. It's adjacent to Imperial Beach, which is a big development, which would love to develop this land. It was saved largely because it was a garbage dump before, and it was also where the Navy tested its bombardment tactics in the 1940s. It is adjacent to the Navy helicopter test site, where the Navy teach people how to fly helicopters, and often in fact, you can never be here without 1 to 4 helicopters overhead, sometimes Navy SEALs dangling from them. It's also close to a very large, sprawling suburb, so there are kids on their BMX bikes, and there are rangers chasing those kids, trying to get them off. So this is not like the most restful wildlife sanctuary you've ever heard of. But if you're a bird who needs to nest on a beach, this is your best shot in many miles. If you're a fish that needs to go upriver, Tijuana River is the river. If you're a garbage-eating raccoon or possum, this is probably where you spend the day sleeping it off. And so it's essentially a landscape of mischief. And I was really interested in that, in the vernacular of mischief in buildings. And so I built this, which looked like it could be left over from the Navy, or it could be a surveillance thing from the immigration police. It's sited on this beautiful bomb crater, which is absolutely filled with migrating birds. And how you see this piece is you go to the park ranger, you give them your license or some ID, they give you the key, and you hike out what's about 3 miles. So none of my friends from New York saw this work. And then you open this building, and instead of mischief, what you find is a kind of Mecca for birders. This is like a bird watcher's paradise. It's full of the kind of things that turn birders on. Lists and maps and graphs and charts and photographs that look like the triumph of nature photography, birds up close, but they're actually all dead birds from the Natural History Museum. And reference books, and of course there's lots of optics, and there's recording devices, and there's watercolors and pencils, and there's a hall of fame of people who have done a lot for birds, people like Marjorie Stoneham Douglas and Roger Torrey Peterson and Rachel Carson. There's a map in case you want to build a bird. So, and people were allowed to come here and hang out, and people did hang out. And this project was open for about 4 months. Not one thing was stolen, not one thing was vandalized, not one thing was broken. I mean, it was kind of extraordinary. So as I said, my friends in New York couldn't see that piece, so I made one for them as well. So this is the Urban Wildlife Observation Unit, which has probably the biodiversity of your parking lot out here. And so I manned that with a very talented and charismatic DJ who was probably the most ignorant person of the natural world who I'd ever encountered. So really a nice guy. But if you had a question about nature, you probably shouldn't be asking him. But his job was actually to encourage you to come into this place where it was a kind of clearinghouse of information. So, we changed the aesthetic of it a bit. The other piece looked much more like something from the from the military period, from the 40s. It had all that great steel desk furniture. And this is much more kind of the Theodore Roosevelt era. We even have a diorama to acknowledge the natural history museums in New York in there. And so, and of course, people came in and used the optics, although I think very few four-legged animals were seen with those optics. And just in case you didn't get anything out of that, we produced a field guide to the wildlife of Madison Square Park, which has entrances for things like squirrels, pigeons, grass, things that you might actually encounter in the park itself. And this became something I really liked to do, this producing these field guides. In relationship to really traditional, working with a really traditional notion of the folly, this is a very strange park in Austria. It is called Schloss Graveneck, and it was a Gothic castle. In the 19th century, the Duke who owned this castle took a trip to around Europe and decided that his Gothic castle wasn't Gothic enough, so he made a neo-Gothic castle out of his Gothic castle. And so that's why it looks like it's very Disney-esque in a sense. And he also built beautiful French formal gardens and English gardens, and gardens in the English landscape garden tradition. One of those, in the French formal garden, there was a beautiful fountain that had a small box cider hedge about so high, and the fountain was hit by lightning and destroyed. So they cleaned out the ruins and they let the box cider hedge grow over 150 years until it achieved this height of 22 feet, which you see there. And it's a perfect circle. I think it's kind of a remarkable thing because box cider grows so slowly. But the public to this castle seemed to think that that was the outdoor restaurant. And so the gardeners wanted to cut down this kind of amazing thing. And so I thought, well, I'm going to come up with a piece that makes them save this. And so I built this ruined tower, which was incredibly difficult to make inside this box cider circle. And the tower, you can, through the area that the public had made, the hole in the circle, you can enter through and appear through the window of this tower. And what was fascinating me about the French formal garden tradition and the English picturesque garden tradition is that they both represent nature, volume 10, all the time, right? You never get a sense of nature as a cycle. It's always nature full on. So what's missing is that notion of the cycle of nature. What's missing is the other part of nature, death and decay. So I wanted to make a shrine for that within this garden. So you could find death and decay somewhere in the garden, and here it is. So you look through that window and you see a perfectly constructed diorama of a forest scene with a dead deer in the center. And the deer is in the process of decomposing. She's covered with maggots and flies, and there are mushrooms, and there are crows and other animals about to eat her. So that kind of course, a not entirely unplayful reference to Bambi as well, and so to a certain kind of forest culture going on in Germany and Austria. How these projects work generally is I'm invited to a place, and I get to snoop around and find an interesting location, find a tidbit of social history, find an opportunity to make something and to go against the grain of the culture that exists, or to celebrate an aspect of the culture that exists, or whatever the motivation. So on one hand, it's an incredibly great job to have. I was invited to go to Essen in Germany, which is the former coal mining region, not the most beautiful part of the country, a region which has a lot of problems ecologically because the coal mines make it impossible to have pipes. So all of the sewage has to travel above ground. So it has a smell, this region. So I was brought to an area which I was interested in working, the marina, and it was February, and it was bitterly cold. And the marina is a kind of expansive, partially unfrozen water, and absolutely filled with birds, with water birds, with gulls, with mergansers, with ducks, with geese. So, But we arrived there. It was so cold. We had to go into this small little house that was there. This is obviously not taken in February, but this is the house. And so we enter into this space. It's 9 o'clock in the morning, bitterly cold, and suddenly it's like you're in a tavern scene from a Hobbit movie. There are lots of gigantic men, and they're laughing and roaring and drinking schnapps and beer, and the walls of this place are caramel-colored from years and years of cigarette smoke. There are girly pictures behind the bar, and so we get our coffee and we're drinking. And I'm like, what the hell is this place? And it's the fishing club. It's the Fisherman's Club. The Fisherman's Club. So when is fishing season open? Oh, in May. So I thought, this is like great. Here are these guys. They're having a wonderful time. They're all of that. They're telling stories. They're laughing. They're telling jokes. And it's all based on their relationship with an animal, with fish. And but at the same time, it's kind of this extremely testosterone-driven place. I mean, I haven't felt like that kind of testosterone since I was in the locker room in high school, probably. And so I thought, well, I want to make a place like that. But I want to make it not for machos, but for dandies. So this is the Amateur Ornithologist Clubhouse. So we found, I found this amazing oxygen tank at the sewage treatment plant. So this was used for pumping oxygen into the sewage treatment process. And we modified it. We built the tower. We opened up new windows to it. We built our own hobbit door. And so this is for the gentle folk of Essen to come and spend an afternoon contemplating our feathered creatures. So, and which, just because it's for dandies doesn't mean that you can't have fun, because as far as I can tell, clubs are only about drinking and smoking. So you can also do those things here, but you can only smoke larks. And you can only drink Grey Goose, wild turkey, famous grouse, toucan rum. There's a few other things. And there's this has an attendant, and she or he keeps track of all the birds people see. Everything is kind of cataloged and listed. You see also this frieze of famous naturalist names, and everything in this building is related to birds. And of course, it's Germany, so there's super great kitsch there, and great ceramics, prints. Every aspect is bird-related. Okay, what do you think? Time to stop? Oh, no, let's do one more. Come on, we're going to do one more. One more. Okay, this is it, I promise. So this is the city of Folkestone, and again, I was invited to come to Folkestone. Folkestone was a great seaside town in the 19th and early 20th century. It was, it was this place with magnificent hotels and homes. It was the place where people like Bernard Shaw lived there, and H.G. Wells. That's where the Prince of Wales would take his mistress. So this kind of amazing place. And since then, since British people, I guess, vacation only in Ibiza and places like that, places like Folkestone have fallen on harder times. There was a company in Folkestone that was their home headquarters, and the director retired, and he's given all of his money to create these a sculpture triennial. So every 3 years, there's a big sculpture exhibition to kind of bring people to Folkestone and show them what an amazing place this is. And it is an amazing place. I also grew up in a seaside town, so I really identified with that. And I noticed that the one thing that was maybe different from my seaside town is people here hated gulls. Absolute hatred of them. And I thought, why is that? And they hate gulls because some people love gulls too much. So people would feed gulls. And gulls are, of course, very intelligent, very adaptive animals. So they would learn to associate people with food. And they would demand food. And so if you come out of your fish and chip shop on Friday, the gull will come from behind you at 40 miles an hour and knock your French fries onto the ground, and all the gulls will come down. There's a gull that knows how to work the electric door at Tesco and can walk into Tesco, pick up a bag of chips, and take it out and open it. So So this created some kind of animosity. But of course, gulls are fascinating. They're like remarkable animals, and they're also some of the animals that have been studied so thoroughly by ethologists that we can really understand a lot about gulls. We can't speak gull, but you can understand gull. You can understand a lot about gulls. So what the gulls really have is a PR problem. And so what the gulls really need is a mobile gull appreciation unit. So the mobile gull appreciation unit travels through the city of Folkestone, and my gull enthusiasts with evangelical fervor, they convince people that to know gulls is to love them. And what we find out, much to our surprise, is that people actually didn't hate the gulls. It's a very small, very noisy, very grumpy minority, not unlike the Tea Party, who hate the gulls, but the vast majority of people really had positive stories. So we ended up becoming more of a kind of site for collecting positive gull stories than disseminating things about gulls. Although my gull had a lot of attitude, a little intimidation perhaps. But we also did produce another field guide which teaches you a few easy introductions to gull vocalizations and behavior. So it is you can really understand gull. So thank you.